some notes about Paul. For those of you who don't know him, he manages, of course, the intelligence section of the journal and manages the book reviews as well. But he's also the editor-in-chief, if you're not aware, of the Napoleon series that Bob Burnham has kindly put into our care. And Paul now is the chief editor for the Napoleon series. He is the man to go to for prisoner of war history. He's written 2 books on the subject, both of them very well received. In fact, so well received that last night I noticed that one of them, a used copy of one of his books, was selling for almost $70 in the States. There may have been a typo there, but I thought that's just the caliber of the guy that clearly is making far too much money from writing that nobody else does. He is the man to go to, particularly for Norman Cross Prison. And of course, he was the authority for the Time Team dig. He was also instrumental in getting the decapitated French Wounded Eagle monument restored that disappeared from Norman Cross. And he's also been involved in other TV events, as well as speaking right across the country on the subject of prisoners of war during the Napoleonic period. He's going to talk to us about the prison hulks. And my last comment before handing over to Paul, I've always wanted to say this, is I have great expectations of this talk about prison hulks. Paul.
Right, thank you for that introduction. Yes, Magwitch does not feature in this talk, I'm afraid, so but a few other names do. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about the English prisoner of war hulks and tell the story of the sort of prisoner of war system during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and look at the ominous, in inverted commas, reputation that some of these hulks supposedly had. Now, the whole story of prison ships over the centuries has been full of misinformation, fake news, and confusion. Hulks have been used for housing prisoners of all sorts since the 18th century. There were some hulks at New York in 1776, which had a very unsavoury reputation. Some hulks used for Jacobite prisoners in the Thames in 1745. The French used hulks for convicts as well, and the Spanish hulks at Cadiz were really horrendous during the Napoleonic Wars. The English convict hulks were run concurrently with the war prison system, but they were a separate entity, and I'm not going to talk about those. But I think that historians over the last 100 years or so tend to talk about convict hulks and war prison hulks in the same breath, as it were, and confuse the two. Convict hulks were far worse than the hulks that I'm going to describe today. So many historians assume that hulks equals all bad and ominous prisons for these prisoners of war. There's also coloured by French writers who experienced the hulks during the Napoleonic period, and later on in the 1830s and 40s wrote down their experiences for a French audience. And they portrayed the English prison ships as hellholes and the sort of worst type of imprisonment that could be inflicted upon a Frenchman. So it's very much a biased view, and I'll explain the truth of this story. Now, misinformation is the middle name of this chap, Ambroise Louis Garneret. He had a very interesting career, sailing on board sort of frigates and privateers, and he was captured in 1806 and sent to the Prothey prison ship in Portsmouth Harbour. And the picture there on the left actually shows the prison ships in Portsmouth Harbour as he painted them later on. Now, he turned his captivity into a career opportunity. He was on board the Prothey prison ship. He was a bit of an artist then, but he developed his talents for painting portraits and seascapes. And about a year after his initial captivity, he was sent on parole to Bishop's Waltham. And after the war, he had a very good career as an artist. He was employed as a marine artist by the Duc d'Angoulême, part of the French court. And in the 1840s, he wrote a series of books and newspaper articles about his adventures as a prisoner of war. Now, basically, he had a really quite a comfortable captivity, about a year on board the Prothe prison ship, then a few years on parole at Bishop's Waltham, earning quite a bit of money from his art. So he decided to write all these adventures of daring do on board the prison ships with himself as a central character. Now, basically, his history is a ripping yarn. Unfortunately, a lot of historians have used his account as being the basis for this is what the prison ships were like, when really it's a lot of fiction. However, having read some of his books, I have still come across some of the stories that he's used and put himself as the central character that are very similar to other prisoner stories as well. So I think there's a bit of plagiarism there as well. But his books are very good read. They're ripping yarns, but don't take them as this truth behind the war prison system. What sort of numbers are we looking at? Between 1793 and 1815, around about 200,000 prisoners of war of many different nationalities arrived in this country. During the Napoleonic period, with over 122,000 there, just over 10,000 died in captivity. And again, a lot of historians will latch on to the figure of deaths in the prison ships and think prisoners died, therefore these hulks must have been terrible places. And I shall explain the story behind the deaths of these prisoners and put it into some sort of context later. And only about 17,000 or so were sent home sick or on parole. The highest total we had in any one year was 72,000 in 1813. And during this long period of conflict, the prison ships saw many different nationalities being held on board. So it wasn't just French, but German, Dutch, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Danish, Swedish, American, white and black prisoners, men, women and children, and military and civilian prisoners as well. All these people were swept up in this wide-ranging worldwide conflict of the time. And they were placed into a system that was run by the Transport Office of the Admiralty. And they had offices situated at Somerset House in London. And if you go to Somerset House now and go up the Nelson stairs, these rooms at the top of those stairs was where this system was administered. And the Transport Office consisted of a number of commissioners, naval and civilian, and they oversaw the prison system and regularly visited all the prison depots, including the prison ships, to see what was being done on a day-to-day basis. And by the latter part of the 18th century, the Royal Navy had had a vast experience in not only warfare, but also administration as well. And so this was a really powerful administrative weapon that the country had during the revolutionary Napoleonic period. And it was this system that processed all those 200,000 prisoners of war. There were three types of prison depot. The prison ship depots, which I shall talk about this evening, where the agent there was a naval officer of the rank of captain in charge. The land prisons, such as Dartmoor Prison, Porchester Castle, Norman Cross, again, a naval officer was in administrative charge. And parole depots. And these are the towns and villages around the country where officers were allowed to reside on parole and billeted upon the local population, provided they signed an undertaking not to cause trouble and not to attempt to escape. Prisoners could be moved around this system quite regularly, so it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a prisoner coming into the system would spend all his confinement on board a prison ship. If the prison ship needed some refurbishment, he might find himself and all the prisoners on board sent to a land prison if there was a room there. So some prisoners moved around the system, and prisoners who caused problems in the land prisons, as we shall see, could be moved back to the prison ships for close confinement. And again, this happened with officers as well. Officers who were persistent escapers, perhaps were gathering intelligence about what was happening in the country at that time, could be sent to hulks as well for close confinement. So prisoners would be moved around the system. And the prison ships were garrisoned by the Marines and militia units, land prisons by regiments of militia, and the parole depots, the local troop of yeomanry could be called upon to deal with any problems that might arise. Now, the Transport Office had a wide-ranging number of things to do regarding prisoners of war. They had to find accommodation for them. They had to sort out contracts around the country to feed and clothe them. They had to employ surgeons to look after their health. And they had to organise exchange cartels with the different warring nations and account for every farthing of expenditure to Parliament while they did that. So they were kept very busy. And those commissioners, those naval and civilian commissioners, regularly visited all the prison depots to see how things were being done on a day-to-day basis. And they were accessible to the prisoners on board the prison ships in the land prisons as well. So if prisoners had complaints about the food or the accommodation or the clothing or whatever, they could actually bring this up with the commissioner when the commissioner visited the actual depot to see what was happening on a day-to-day basis. And if the commissioner felt that the complaint was justified, it will be investigated and measures put in place to improve things. And all that information was sent back to the Transport Office. And one of the joys of researching this subject is the fact that the Transport Office was incredibly efficient in keeping all its records, which are all cross-referenced at the time and filed away very neatly. And there are literally thousands of volumes that you can sort of wade through to get an idea of what life was like for specific prisoners. You can follow a prisoner's captivity through his whole confinement on board a prison ship, for example. Some prisoners spent quite a long time in captivity. For example, La Créole, a French frigate, was captured in the West Indies in 1803. The crew shipped across the Atlantic to England, and they remained in the Portsmouth hulks until June 1814. So some prisoners spent the entire Napoleonic period in captivity. Whether a prisoner was sent to a prison ship or a land prison depended on what space was available. The Transport Office tended to keep batches of prisoners together for administrative ease. So a batch of prisoners from Trafalgar, for example, would be sent to the hulks at Chatham or to Portsmouth, just to sort of keep them all together so they knew where they were and how they could contact any individual prisoner if need be. Now, the prison ship depots, the subject I'm going to talk about this evening, there were three of them: Portsmouth, Plymouth and Chatham, all major naval bases. Prison ships were old prison hulks, old warships or captured prizes that were no longer fit for seagoing service and could be used for other purposes. And these hulks could be used for sort of guard ships, store ships, receiving ships, and prisons as well. The problem with having these hulks in your major naval bases, problems of possible security issues. Gradually over time, more and more enemy nationals were arriving at the major naval bases that were very important in Britain's war effort. And many did question the sort of sense of having so many enemy nationals in and around a major naval base. So, for example, certainly by 1812, 1813, in the Portsmouth area, you got 9,000 prisoners on these sort of prison ships, 7,000 at Porchester Castle, 3,000 at Forton, about 500 officers out in the parole depots in the countryside. So you've got sort of nearly over 20,000 enemy nationals in and around a very important and significant naval base. So there were concerns regarding the security of these prisoners. And from 1810 onwards, as the more and more prisoners came into the country, more prisons were constructed in the north of England and in Scotland. A few examples of the prison ships in Portsmouth. In 1798, the Fortitude prison ship was home to 750 black prisoners taken in the French service in the West Indies. The San Damaso had just over 800 Dutch prisoners on board. The Prove contained 148 French naval officers who had refused to give their parole or been refused parole, and 264 boys captured on board merchant vessels and privateers. Of those youngsters, 3 were of 9 years of age, 5 of 10, and 32 of 11 years of age. So children were swept up into the conflict as well. And you can imagine the effect of the environment upon the youthful minds such as that. This is what prison ships look like on the outside. You just had one mast left, but most of the rigging was removed. Note the walkway at sea level. This was so sentries could patrol all around this sort of lower part of the ship. Prisoners did attempt to tunnel out of these vessels, so it was a very good idea to have a sentry at sea level there. The hut on board the prison ship was for storing the hammocks of the prisoners during the day, and those aren't signal flags flying there, that's the prisoners' laundry. So these war prisons were designed for maximum security with lots of sentries around them. Prison ship staff, each prison depot had an agent, a captain in the Royal Navy in overall charge, with a staff of first and second clerk and one or two boatmen to sort of row him around the depot. On board each ship, the administrative commander was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, again with a ship's crew of master's mate, midshipmen, seamen, and 4 boys. It was that section of the system that could be problematic, because commanding a prison hulk was a very mundane, routine command for these officers. Many of them, some of them, took to drink. And it was quite often the sort of commissioners would find the sort of commander on board one of these vessels drunk when they arrived, unexpected to see what things were happening on a day-to-day basis. When you look at the surviving ship's logs for some of these vessels, the day-to-day routine was either recording the weather or recording stores being brought on board, and possibly problems amongst the crew, which I'll come on to in a minute. The surgeon had a clerk and a steward there on board each ship. Up until 1796, there were problems with surgeons on board some of these ships. Many of them were sort of pursuing their private practices ashore, not paying much attention to their employment as a sort of a surgeon on board one of these prison ships. But the sort of transport office shook that up and told them if they want to be employed, they had to reside on board the prison ships. But when you look at the actual logs for some of these vessels, you find that the Marines and seamen on board tended to cause more trouble than some of the prisoners did. The log of the Bahama prison ship, 19th of July, 1809. Marine George Brown was given 48 lashes for contempt, neglect of duty, disobedience, and drawing his bayonet on his superior officer. 11th of August, 1809. Moses Seaman, a seaman, 24 lashes for contempt and neglect of duty. 12th of August, 1809, William Wilson, a seaman, 36 lashes for contempt. And there's quite a lot of entries for punishments for the seamen and Marines on board these vessels. So it must have been a very mundane, very tedious duty for most of the crew on board. The security on board the ships was very tight. I mentioned the walkway at sea level there, and lots of 3-pounder swivel guns placed all around the ship to sort of quell any disturbance that might occur there as well. The Royal Marines were the sort of first group of troops to actually sort of garrison these vessels, but when there weren't enough Marines in any of the Marine divisions to sort of form garrisons on board, units of militia in the area would send detachments to the prison ships to help with the security as well. Now, all these prison ships weren't single entities. They worked together as part of a prison ship depot. In the event of trouble, they all worked together to actually quell it. And this is an interesting picture by Francois Saint-Jean. Now, he was a prisoner of war on board one of the prison ships at Chatham. And he's painted this night view of the hulks at Chatham. And this night view tells a story. Now, I've annotated the main bits. If you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see some escaping prisoners there. Those little flashes of the sort of flashes of the muskets of the sort of guards at the sea level walkway shooting at these escaping prisoners. All the ships have hoisted signal lanterns to the top of their mast there to warn each other and the authorities ashore that trouble is afoot. So if any prisoners do manage to swim to shore, no doubt there will be some units of militia waiting to pick them up. And all the ships have launched their guard boats to patrol around the depot to make sure no other prisoners on board any of the other ships take advantage. And this actual event here of these escaping prisoners was recorded in the log of the Bahama on the 9th of December, 1809. 9:30, a signal gun being made that prisoners had made their escape from the Glory. sent armed boats in search of them and took 6 that had escaped. It was very rare for prisoners to actually get to shore. Some did drown in the process of escaping by swimming. Here's a French picture of the interior of a prison ship. Rather a sort of tall, rather a high sort of deck height there, I think, but it's artistic license there. It's quite an interesting one because it does show some activities of prisoners of war. If I can get my model boat there, I'm not sure what these prisoners are doing here, whether they're actually making a model or whatever. Practicing their fencing, dancing lessons just there. That's reading newspapers. And this chap is either sort of working on a prisoner's shoes or clothing. Some prisoners could find work amongst the prisoner population, working for their colleagues, making clothes, mending shoes, making buttons, whatever. There was an internal market within the sort of war prison system. This is the hammock plan of the orlop deck of the Brunswick prison ship at Chatham. Now, it was a crowded environment there, and the Brunswick at Chatham serves to illustrate this. Now, the measurements I have here are these sort of old money, as it were. The orlop deck was 125 feet in length, the breadth 40 feet at the waist, and the height 4 feet 10 inches. And 460 prisoners were crowded onto this deck at night, and 6 feet was allocated for each hammock space there. The atmosphere, as you can imagine, in such an environment at night was stifling, even in winter, while in summer the prisoners went about naked to obtain some relief from the heat. So it was very warm, very humid down there. And it was said that the guards who removed the hatch covers each morning were often overcome by this onrush of stench from below. So prisoners of many nationalities and many ages were crowded into this environment, often for many years. One prisoner that I shall come back to later on, Nicholas Roux, a French seaman captured at Trafalgar, wasn't released from the Portsmouth hulks until 1814, and he'd arrived there in 1806. Prisoners were given a clothing ration of a bright yellow material with TO for Transport Office stamped on it. Now, there were 2 reasons for giving them this brightly coloured outfit. The first was, obviously, if they escaped and you saw this bright apparition in the countryside, you'd know it was an escaped prisoner. But the other main reason for it was that one of the sort of constant problems in all the prison depots, on board all the prison ships, was gambling. And many prisoners gambled away their food and clothing ration, or sold their clothing ration to unofficial provision buyers amongst their colleagues, who would sort of prey upon their weaker-minded colleagues and buy up this clothing, and then sell it on to either other prisoners or quite often to soldiers of the garrison and the wives of the garrison as well. And if some of this material started appearing in the local countryside, then the authorities knew that government stores were being pilfered somewhere along the line, and hopefully trace it back and prosecute the people involved. So that's the reason for having this brightly coloured outfit. It was the same in all the prison depots. So whether they were on board a prison ship or in a land prison, they got this same clothing ration, and also the same food ration as well. £1.5 of bread per day, half a pound of meat, including the bone, apart from 2 days a week, which were fish days, plus an assortment of vegetables. And sometimes other vegetables would be substituted for the cabbage and potatoes, depending what was in season at the time. And 2 pints of small beer per day as a part of their ration. But there was a canteen on board each prison ship where the prisoners could purchase extra small beer. It was a consistent diet. So regardless of what the price of corn was doing, whether the harvest had failed and the price of corn went up, or certain items on this menu couldn't be acquired easily, prisoners always got a consistent diet, regardless of what was happening in the rest of the country. And it was better often than many civilians were actually getting at the time. In 1795, the Transport Office did an audit of all the war prisons in the country, and a commissioner went down to a small prison at Bodmin in Cornwall, which was which consisted of a few old dilapidated farm buildings, and 300 French prisoners were being housed there. But there was no escapes, no trouble, didn't seem to be any disturbances at all amongst this prisoner population. And the commissioner inquired amongst the prisoners why they seemed so happy in captivity. And they informed him that the food they were getting as prisoners of war was far better than the food they'd been receiving back in France. And he wrote in his report, "Perhaps we ought not to make this public. Prisoners were often getting fed better than the local civilian population." Note the cabbage in the diets there. I'll come back to that later. One French prisoner, in his account of life on board one of the prison ships, when he wrote it in 1835, he wrote, "Half the time they give us provisions which the very dogs refuse. Half the time the bread is not baked. It is only good to bang against a wall. The meat looks as if it's been dragged in the mud for miles. Twice a week we get putrid salt food, that is to say, herrings on Wednesday and codfish on Saturday. We have several times refused to eat it, and as a result got nothing in its place, and at the same time are told that anything is good enough for a Frenchman. Therein lies the motive of their barbarity." This is a blatant lie. In actual fact, each prison ship, each land prison, had a prisoner committee. And this was composed of 3 of the most educated, respected prisoners amongst that prisoner population, who could oversee the delivery and distribution of the rations. And if they felt that some of the sort of food that was being delivered wasn't of sufficient quality, they could reject it. And invariably the agent would agree. If there was any disagreement there, then next time the commissioner came along to visit that prison depot, he would be asked to investigate it. But the prisoners could reject what they felt wasn't fit for consumption. Quite often, this would be the meat. You can imagine in a very hot summer, the meat arriving from a slaughterhouse to the actual prison ship might not be in tip-top condition. And if the French decided that it wasn't good enough for them, they could reject it. And the contractor would be told to go and replace it with better quality. While he wasn't going to lose out on his outlay there, the poor quality meat that had been rejected by the prisoners would be sent in the local town, would be sold in the local towns and villages to the civilian population, and better quality stuff provided for the prisoners of war. So prisoners were getting fed somewhat better than many civilians. And very occasionally there were complaints about the standard of bread that was being issued to these prisoners, whereupon the Transport Office would instruct all agents in all the depots to send a sample loaf to Somerset House. They would look at it, decide if there were any irregularities in the sort of contractors providing poor quality bread, and then send a sample loaf back of what they wanted to be issued to the prisoners back to each depot. So there was a very detailed investigation of any problems regarding poor quality food. So any sort of Frenchman who wrote later on that they were getting very poor quality food stuff is exaggerating for a French audience. Each prison ship had a hospital berth, and there was usually at least one hospital ship in each prison depot as well. And the medical staff on the hospital ships consisted of a surgeon, 1 to 6 assistant surgeons. Now, these assistant surgeons were French and Dutch medical men who were out in the country on parole and who volunteered to serve on board the prison ships, looking after their sort of compatriots on board. So it was very much an international healthcare team looking after any sick prisoner. And there was a clerk, matron, seamstress, and the nursing staff were drawn from the prisoner of war population. So prisoners could obtain a little bit of employment as nurses on board these hospital ships. And prisoners did go into the hospitals. Prisoners were cured, some died, but these medical men did the best they could for the prisoners in their care. If we look at the deaths at Chatham Prison Ship Depot between 1794 and 1815, this shows the different nationalities who sort of died there and who were buried on the mudflats in Gillingham Creek. Now, a lot of historians, when they're talking about the prison ship depots, latch onto the figure, oh, 1,306 prisoners died there. The system must have been bad. Land prisons were supposed to be better than the prison ships, and many saw prisoners on board the prison ships would hope to be transferred to such a land depot. A place like Norman Cross had 1,770 deaths during its existence as well. So these people died wherever they were. It wasn't purely because they were on board a prison ship. I've looked at the deaths at Chatham during this period. I thought I'd just show you a graph of those deaths between 1803 and 1815. Prisoners didn't die because they were prisoners of war. They died because they were products of their time. And when surgeons, when the sort of physicians from the Admiralty went to visit these prison ship depots, they recorded that prisoners were dying of the same ailments that seamen and marines were dying of in naval barracks and hospitals. Hospital ships for the Royal Navy recorded the same sort of deaths as well. And these men were dying of these various diseases that they would have died of on campaign as well. So there was nothing different about the ailments affecting these men, women, and some children. It was all down to crowd and hygiene at that time, a lack of understanding of what caused disease, how it was actually spread, and crowding people together in any sort of environment which facilitated the spread of infectious disease. So what did these people die of? Well, in 1804, you'll see a little spike there of a few more prisoners dying. The vertical scale is 0 to 250, so it gives you an idea of numbers dying there. A lot of prisoners arrived in the system with pre-existing conditions. And one of the sort of common ailments that many French seamen had when they arrived as prisoners of war was scurvy in various stages. And this was a constant problem with French seamen coming into the system, in that they went straight into the prison hospital to be cured of scurvy. The cabbage in the diet would help, and lime juice was acquired by the surgeon to help with the curing of these cases. But in 1804, a number of French seamen arrived straight into the system, suffering from scurvy, but were too far gone to be cured. But they went down as deaths within the prison system, even though it's a pre-existing condition. Crowding all those prisoners on the all-op deck, for example, warm and humid at night, so respiratory illness would spread very, very quickly. Consumption was endemic amongst the sort of European and American populations at that time. And so many people were coming into the system, incubating consumption. Perhaps they contracted it as well during their stay. But in amongst all those deaths for each year, there's a continual sort of trickle of men and women dying of consumption on board. Fever caused by whatever at that time. A lot of cases of fever. Malaria was endemic in the country at the time, so that would sort of send people to their grave. Typhus, either described by the surgeons on the death certificate as typhus fever or simply fever. So you find in 1809 and again in 1813, 1814, large outbreaks of typhus on board the prison ships at Chatham. In 1813, 1814, especially amongst the prison ships housing the Danes and the Americans as well. 1813, 1814, once the typhus epidemic receded, along came an outbreak of smallpox. But the Admiralty was very progressive in its using new innovations, and so the new smallpox vaccination was used for treating or containing the smallpox outbreak. There were violent deaths as well. Some prisoners attempted to escape. There are a few suicides, a few murders. I've got some examples here of some of the people who died at Chatham. Carolina Parisienne. She was the wife of a dragoon captured at the Battle of Sahagun in December 1808. Her husband died of his wounds in transit between Spain and England, and Carolina found herself placed on board one of the hulks at Chatham, and she died after a couple of months' captivity. Cause of death, grief and fatigue. We find Louis Breton, a privateer seaman, 23 years of age. Cause of death: effected his escape from the ship, but was drowned in the attempt to swim to shore. William Butler was a black seaman serving on board an American merchant vessel. He died in April 1814 of consumption. He's one of those Americans buried at Chatham. There was even a woman who died in childbirth. A Dutch lady died in childbirth on board one of the prison ships. And her newborn daughter, Beatrice, at 6 days of age, she also died as well. So that's the youngest death on board these ships. There are a few suicides amongst these prisoners. Gilles Lepilleur was a French seaman taken at Trafalgar. He arrived on the hulks at Chatham in 1806, but by 1810 he may have had enough of captivity. His cause of death is recorded as by stabbing himself with a knife, which entered his heart and caused almost immediate death. Michael Kelly was an Irishman, born in Dublin. He was in the Regiment Irlandaise, and he was part of the garrison at Flushing in 1809. And when the British launched their expedition there, he was captured, and he spent a couple of years in captivity on board the hulks at Chatham before he was murdered by another prisoner. So prisoners died of all sorts of different ailments and different acts as well. So you get a whole community and all the things that the community would be affected by appearing on the prison ships. One prisoner recorded that his prison ship home in fog it was weird, in moonlight it was spectral. And many prisoners were regarded as being of low social standing, not just by the authorities, but by their fellow prisoners as well. Baron de Bonnefou wrote, "There existed neither fear, reserve, nor self-respect among that class that could not claim the benefits of education. Among them reigned openly the most perverse immorality, the most shameful outrages to modesty, the most revolting of actions, the most unblushing cynicism, and in the midst of the general misery, one added misery greater than can be conceived." I'll mention what that was in a minute. An American agreed with this view. He wrote, "Such a sink of vice I never saw or ever dreamt of as I have seen here." Another Frenchman recorded, "Life on them, the hulks, is the touchstone of a man's character." There was a seedier side to life on board the prison ships. There was certainly a homosexual prostitution ring on board the prison ships at Chatham, and the prison ships could be used by the agents in the land depots to get rid of all their bad characters. And there were some bad characters. Jack Sylvester was sent to the hulks at Chatham for beating a man and occasioning his death, very troublesome on board, frequently threatened the life of Mr. Waters, the mate, and others. Francois Soulet was a very sly and dangerous character. Hendrik Kratzensen, a Prussian, who found himself in the garrison at Flushing again, was an evil-disposed and disaffected person. George Salerno, when he was held in the prison at Valletta on Malta, he had frequently declared his determination to assassinate the turnkeys, was the cause of continual riots and disturbances in the prison. Because the hulks were seen as a more closer confinement of captives, many agents at the land prisons used them to send their bad characters for close confinement and get them out of the land prison depots as well. However, this could cause problems. Captain Pressland, the agent at Norman Cross, was a little bit gung-ho in sending all his troublesome characters to the hulks at Chatham, so much so that the agent in command there complained to the Admiralty that he was getting all the bad apples in the sort of prisoner of war basket. And so this was bound to cause a lot of problems in terms of security for him. So Pressland was advised not to send too many of these bad characters to Chatham, but to try and punish them on a local basis. But even so, the threat of being sent to a prison ship could be used as a punishment or threatened punishment for prisoners who were continually troublesome, not just to the authorities, but to their colleagues as well. But aside from the seedier side of life, there were prisoner activities on board, their manufacturing activities, making their bone and straw models, education. People took classes in various languages, mathematics, navigation, in fencing, dancing. There were a limited amount of theatrical performances on board some of the prison ships as well. Religion played a big part in their lives. Certainly by 1810, William Towes, a Methodist minister, was given permission to attend to the hulks at Chatham, and he worked with the more educated, more respected members of the sort of French prisoner of war population there, and sort of set up classes to sort of educate prisoners, teach them to read and write. He set up libraries on board the prison ships, educating the prisoners in the sort of religious tracts and stories, and distributed Bibles to the prisoners who wanted them as well, which the authorities were very happy for him to do so, because it gave the prisoners something positive to get involved in, and so took their minds and hands away from more illegal activities. And there certainly were some illegal activities. Some prisoners gambled away their food and clothing, so gambling was a constant problem. Forging of banknotes took place, not just on board some of the prison ships, but in land prisons as well. This was a capital offence, and if it could be proved in the local court that a prisoner had actually forged banknotes, he could be hanged for it. So from 1803 to 1814, a total of 27 prisoners of war of all nationalities were hanged for forgery of banknotes. So only prisoners who committed a law, violated the laws of the land they were being held in, could be tried, and if found guilty, sentenced to death. So those prisoners who committed murder on board the prison ships, if it could be proved that it was murder itself, not manslaughter, or prisoners fought duels, and if it could be proved that the sort of duelist who died in that duel had brought his death upon himself by his temper or his attitude or whatever, the prisoners could be acquitted, but some were hanged for murder and for forging banknotes. And also the not inconsiderable problem of manufacturing lewd and indecent material by some of these prisoners, which was another activity the Admiralty was very much against on board these prison ships. Prison ships were expedient. They were designed, in theory, to be temporary prisons. That's why you use them. You can very easily, very quickly fit out an old hulk as a prison ship if you have noticed that a large number of prisoners is about to arrive in the country. Over time, however, the maintenance costs of a wooden structure on water become expensive. And so it was more cost effective to build more land prisons over time, inland as well, because having too many prison ships situated in and around your major naval bases caused a possible threat to security. So as time went on, prisons were built inland away from the major naval bases. So after 1810, when the prisoner population was expanding quite dramatically, you have places like Dartmoor comes online in 1809. A prison is built at Perth in 1812, specifically for prisoners from the Peninsular Theatre. You have more prisons built up in the sort of north of England and Scotland as well, away from the south coast, away from the major naval bases. Between 1794 and 1801, 22 ships were used across the three prison ship depots. 1803 onwards, 45 ships were in use, and 20 of those came into being in 1810 because of the expansion in the war prison system. Because by 1810, prisoners are coming in large numbers from the Peninsular Theatre, the War of 1812 against America, and the war in the Baltic against Denmark as well. And so again, in 1810, the prisoner population is expanding so rapidly that more depots are put further north in the country. Now I thought I would give you an idea of why the prison ship depots, the prison ships, were ominous structures for the French, not necessarily for other nationalities. Now, if we place ourselves in the mind of Nicholas Roux, a seaman taken at Trafalgar and who arrived on board one of the prison ships in Portsmouth Harbour in 1806. During his lifetime on board the prison ships, he wasn't released until 1814. He would have seen much activity which would have made him question what was happening exactly between Britain and France when it came to prisoner of war activity and the exchange of prisoners of war. So Nicholas Rue arrives on board the prison ships in the harbour in 1806. In 1807, the prison ship establishment is expanded because we start seeing Danish prisoners arriving in the system. Bombardment of Copenhagen in 1807 instigates a conflict in the Baltic between Denmark and Britain. Because Denmark no longer has a large enough fleet to take on the Royal Navy, they sort of fit out a lot of sort of gunboats in the region. It becomes known as the Mosquito War. And this becomes a very serious threat to the Baltic trade. So a lot of prisoners are being taken by both sides in the Baltic region. So Nicholas Rue is seeing prisoners arriving in the system in Portsmouth Harbour from 1807 onwards. He's also seeing Danish prisoners leaving the system quite regularly as well. In May 1809, the island of Anholt in the Baltic was captured by the British. And this became a very convenient centre for prisoner of war exchange. Now, if the Danes had, say, a couple of hundred British naval prisoners they wanted to exchange, under a flag of truce, they would drop them off on the island of Anholt, and an equivalent number of Danes would be exchanged for them. However, if there weren't enough Danish prisoners in the region to exchange for those Britons who'd just been handed over, then as long as the lists were kept accurate, as long as all the paperwork was in place, prisoners from the hulks in Portsmouth, for example, could be exchanged for Britons who had just been landed on Anholt. So Nicholas Rue would see constant departures of Danish prisoners from the prison ship depot in Portsmouth Harbour because of this good exchange system that was working between Britain and Denmark. A very interesting study was published a few years ago by these people, looking at how bad were the British prison hulks in the Napoleonic Wars from the sort of Danish and Norwegian point of view. And their general view was that the hulks didn't have the ominous reputation for Danes as they did for the French. And they looked at a sample size of 3,655 Danish prisoners of war. And they determined that the average length of captivity for these Danes was about 2.5 years, because the exchange system worked between Britain and Denmark. The mortality rate of 2.1%. I have to include in this as well is that many Danes, as we shall see in a minute, didn't get exchanged. They volunteered for service in the British forces, but more about that in a little while. So Nicholas Rue, sitting on board his prison ship in Portsmouth Harbour, is watching Danes come and go. In 1808, he also sees his erstwhile allies, the Spaniards, many of whom were captured alongside him at Trafalgar, leaving the prison system, as the Spaniards are now allied to Britain. There was quite a few disturbances between the French and Spaniards in Portsmouth on board the prison ships and at Forton Prison at Gosport as well. Many sort of Spanish-speaking Frenchmen attempted to smuggle themselves in the batches of Spaniards who were being sort of sent home to take up arms against France. And a lot of the sort of Spaniards took exception to this. They weren't going to have the sort of French taking advantage of them going home. There didn't seem to be much love lost between the two nationalities as well. So 1808, the Spaniards all leave the prison ships. Well, the following year, you start to see a large number of prisoners arriving in the system from the peninsula. It wasn't until the latter part of 1809 you really start to see the prisoner population increasing because of the Iberian theatre. And not just the land campaigns as well. The battles generated large numbers of prisoners of war, but also stragglers were picked up. Prisoners were taken by the inhabitants in Spain as well. And the naval war all around the Spanish coastline and into the Mediterranean as well generated frequent hauls of prisoners that arrived in this country. In 1809, the French armies in Spain consisted not just of French, but all sorts of other nationalities as well. And so as far as the sort of Admiralty were concerned, French meant anyone serving in a French army, and that included the Germans, Poles, Italians, and Dutch as well. So from the latter part of 1809, this theatre was becoming a major source of captives. 1812 to 1813, the Americans arrive. You start to see an increase in the prison establishment at Chatham and Portsmouth. Prison ships were used to accommodate these, and Dartmoor prison as well was another sort of place for American prisoners of war. If we look very briefly at the ships in use at Chatham, I know the table on the left there shows that 11 ships were in use between 1803 and 1814, but if you look at the table on the right, you see a 9 maximum any one time. It just means in the early part of the war, a couple of the older ships were taken out of service, but they were used for a year or two. You can see from 1808, 1809, the war in the peninsula and against Denmark is starting to show an increase in the number of prison ships required for prisoners of war. Then in 1812, we get quite a large increase, up to 9 prison ships, because more prisoners coming from Spain and also the Americans coming into the system as well. Now, Nicholas Roux is seeing the prison ships at his depot of Portsmouth expanding in numbers and the number of nationalities coming and going all the time. He would also see on a regular basis German and Dutch prisoners leaving the prison depots, leaving the prison ships. Germans and Dutch were ideal people to recruit into the British forces. During the 1790s, many of these French émigré units recruited extensively in all the war prisons in this country. But the King's German Legion acquired a lot of recruits in the land prisons and on board the prison ships. Chasseurs Britanniques recruited ex-prisoners of war. And the Royal Marines, Royal Navy, Merchant Navy, and the fishing industry even recruited from amongst the war prisons as well. So some of the prisoners who arrived on board the prison ships literally only spent 2 or 3 weeks in captivity on board before they volunteered for service in the King's German Legion or Royal Marines or whatever unit. So while prisoners were arriving in the system, they were leaving constantly as well, some spending only a few weeks on board. One of the major events that made a lot of prisoners leave the system before the war was over was the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. In the weeks and months after that, a lot of the sort of German nations found themselves within the sort of sphere of influence of the sort of coalition against France, which they joined. They began to put together armies to take part in this sort of war against France and to have some sort of bargaining power perhaps at the negotiating table after the war was over. And where could a lot of these German nations' armies be found? Well, in the war prisons in Britain. So you find the Admiralty receiving letters, requests from, say, the Duke of Hesse, for example. Can I have my army back? Because a couple of battalions were taken prisoner at Badajoz, for example. And so the Admiralty was all too happy to release these prisoners, partly for sort of diplomatic considerations, partly to help the war effort, but also to get prisoners out of the system and reduce the cost of having to look after them. So certainly from December 1813 onwards, we start to see very large numbers of prisoners leaving the system long before the war is over. And when William of Orange landed in Holland in late November, one of the first things he did was start to put together a Dutch army to take part in the coalition. And 2 Dutch officers were stationed in the south of England, 2 up in the east of England, and 2 in the north of England, to actively recruit Dutch and Germans for the newly forming Dutch army on the continent. And I've worked out that something in the region of 20,000 prisoners of war left the war prison system in this country before the war was over, because these units were being recruited to take part in the war against France. So Nicholas Roux is seeing a lot of people coming and going within the war prison system, but not the French. And he would probably agree with this statement from another prisoner, that we are like forsaken people. So why were they forsaken people? Why were the French forsaken? All these other nationalities were coming and going home a lot earlier than Nicholas Roux was. In 1810, Napoleon accused Britain of mistreating French prisoners, confining them on board the prison ships, while Britain retaliated by saying that if regular exchange cartels took place between Britain and France, less hulks would be needed because there'd be a faster turnaround. So more exchange negotiations were initiated in that year to try and solve the problem of French prisoners arriving in the depots in this country and staying there for the duration. Now, in 1780, Britain and France had drawn up a convention of exchange of prisoners of war. And basically, prisoners were exchanged man for man, rank for rank, and they had their equivalents in common men. So an admiral could be exchanged for another admiral or a general or 60 common men. And they worked all the way down the different ranks. And so you could mix and match in an exchange cartel and get people exchanged very quickly. So, for example, Admiral Villeneuve was exchanged for 4 British post captains, each of whom were equivalent to 15 men, which totted up to his 60 common men equivalent. So it really worked like that. And this system worked very well between Britain and Spain, Britain and Denmark, to a certain extent with the United States of America, mainly in the Americas, where distances between various possessions that they could sort of transfer prisoners from were a lot shorter than the sort of vastness of the Atlantic for American prisoners being held in this country, many of whom had to wait for the war to be over before they were exchanged. But the system did work well between every nationality we were at war with, apart from France. Now, why did that not work with France? Well, there were a number of hurdles to overcome. The first one is the chap in the picture on the left there, but there was also a number of other issues that affected the exchange of Britons for Frenchmen. During the Peace of Amiens, many hundreds of Britons had flocked to Europe to see a continent that had been denied to them since the French Revolution. And on the outbreak of war in 1803, about 800 of these Britons were detained by the French. Illegally, Britain thought this was an unfair thing to happen, but they were detained and became known as les détenus and were sort of housed on parole at Verdun. And this was a sticking point with Britain. The Hanoverian soldiers, when France overran Hanover, a lot of Hanoverian soldiers escaped to Britain to sort of join the King's German Legion, but France wanted to include these ex-Hanoverian soldiers as part of the prisoner of war exchange in this system. There was also the question of release of invalids. That convention in 1780 stated that prisoners no longer fit for active service would be sent home automatically without waiting for a formal exchange. And so from 1803 to 1811, Britain released from this country 10,467 Frenchmen who were no longer fit for active service due to sort of loss of limbs, for example, ongoing chronic health problems, certified by surgeons as being no longer fit for active service. In return, and that is not a typo, the number of Britons released from France was 13. So this was another sticking point with Britain. In 1810, there were 43,683 French in England and about 12,500 Britons in France. And so if all these were exchanged man for man, rank for rank, there would still be a large number of Frenchmen languishing in the prisons in England who couldn't be exchanged. So the French proposed that Spanish and Portuguese prisoners be exchanged for French prisoners in this country. Initially, Britain said, no, you deal exclusively with those governments, their governments, to over prisoner of war exchange. But eventually, when it was obvious that the exchange negotiations weren't going anywhere, they relented Well, then Napoleon came back with this bright idea that those Spanish and Portuguese prisoners would be sort of transported back from France to Spain in Royal Navy ships. It was then that the talks foundered. They were revisited again in 1812, but nothing ever came of it. So people like Nicholas Roux were in the war prisons for the duration. All the other nationalities could come and go. Many of them did spend most of the war if they decided not to join the British service. If they didn't want to join the British service, they would spend the sort of total confinement on board the prison ships for the duration of the conflict. So to summarise, why did the hulks have such an ominous reputation? Well, I reckon it was the sort of length of confinement if you were a Frenchman, because you were a forsaken person. There wasn't an exchange system between Britain and France that would get you back home within a couple of years of first being taken captive. And a Frenchman on board those prison ships, Nicholas Roux, would see all these people coming and going and wonder why he wasn't being included in the sort of transport back to the continent. The claustrophobic environment as well, and if you throw into that these sort of sly and dangerous characters, the sort of bad apples of the war prison system, it can't have been a very pleasant atmosphere, not just being warm and humid, but also from your colleagues as well. So that may very well have affected people's impression of being on board those prison ships. And certainly the sort of French accounts of the system written later in the 19th century were heavily biased, and also misinterpretation by historians who mix up the convict hulks with the war prison system. They were two separate and distinct entities, but many historians seem to confuse the two. That's why I think they had such an ominous reputation. That's the account of the war prison system from the point of view of the prison ships side of the story in this country during that period. I hope it's giving you some idea of, while these ships weren't the lap of luxury, they weren't five-star hotels, they weren't necessarily as bad as many later historians and authors have made them out. So on that note, I will bring my talk to an end and happily take any questions if anybody has them.
Brilliant, brilliant, Paul. Fascinating subject, fascinating subject. Already got a lot of questions, so I'll get straight into them. And please forgive me, folks, if I don't use most questioners' names. Were prisoners of war put to work in agriculture or on road building, etc.?
No, this is a myth. I don't know if prisoners in the earlier wars of the 18th century were still sent out into the countryside to work either on building projects or bringing in the harvest or whatever. But certainly in the last couple of decades of the 18th century, there was riots about Catholic emancipation, the Gordon riots. There was riots against high prices, lack of food and high taxation.
Hello.
Hello? So forth. And so it wasn't practically and diplomatically feasible to unleash all these untaxed, cheap Catholic labourers upon the countryside. Plus, the military often complained about having to guard them inside the prison depots. They didn't have enough troops to guard them outside. So it's a myth that they were actually used to build a road or fortifications or a canal or work outside, bringing in the harvest. They were allowed to do their manufacturing activities within the depots, and some of them got occasional work as labourers and carpenters. Shipwrights and carpenters from amongst French crews found ready work on board these ships, helping to refurbish them, but they weren't allowed outside to work.
How many prisoners were sent to Britain after Waterloo? And if we know anything about it, when were they sent home?
All the prisoners from the Napoleonic period had left by May and June 1814, apart from the Americans, and they were still Americans up until about April 1815. By March 1815, you're starting to see prisoners arriving from the war against France in that year. And something in I think about 7,500 prisoners from the Waterloo campaign came over to this country and were housed in Dartmoor prison. Dartmoor prison was still open for Americans in the early part of that year, and it was still open when the French started arriving, so they kept with that prison depot. And most of those French prisoners had gone home by that February 1816. It's interesting that when war broke out again with Napoleon in 1815, the Admiralty took the view of, here we go again, we're at war with France. And because Dartmoor was open, that could accommodate prisoners from that campaign. They also started planning on refurbishing a lot of the other prison depots so that by 1816 they'd be able to accommodate many thousands more captives. But fortunately, the war was over pretty quickly.
Can you tell us something about the digs on Rat Island and what's been found?
Right, yeah, that's an interesting one, that is. Rat Island in Portsmouth Harbour it's an island that has been used to bury convicts and quite probably prisoners of war from the Napoleonic period. And the interesting thing about this is that since they were buried, a lot of waste material, and so when they've been dredging the harbour, has been dumped on top of them. And the reason these bodies have become exposed is due to sort of storms eroding away the banks on that island. So the archaeological investigation is going in sideways rather than sort of vertically down on these prisoners. But there is some evidence there of possibly some of them were convicts, quite possibly some were prisoners of war as well. I haven't actually looked at the sort of the deaths of prisoners of war on the prison ships in Portsmouth Harbour. I've looked at the death certificates for Chatham there. In Portsmouth Harbour, they were supposed to be buried on the mud flats, and I would also suggest also on Rat Island as well. So there's an ongoing archaeological investigation there, looking at these bones. They become more exposed due to weather erosion of the banks there. But certainly some were convicts and some were prisoners of war.
Did the Navy have prison hulks abroad?
Yes, there were some in Bermuda and some at Jamaica as well, housing not just French but American prisoners too. So they had a few hulks out there, all run by the Transport Office from abroad. So the Transport Office looked after prisoners of war in all the depots around the world as well. So yes, they did in Bermuda and Jamaica.
How did conditions and the treatment of prisoners in Britain compared to that experienced by British prisoners in the French equivalents?
Right, yeah. Napoleon divided prisoners into two categories. First class, i.e. British, and everybody else. Everybody else, all the Germans and Spanish were put into labour battalions, garrison battalions all around Europe. But because there was this disparity in numbers, there was always a large number of Frenchmen being taken and housed in England. The British prisoners were sort of looked after on a par with their counterparts in this country. And they were housed in these sort of border fortresses along the sort of eastern border of France, places like Verdun. Verdun was where the major parole depot for British officers and the Détenu, but also the Citadel was used to house prisoners as well. Biche, Saint-Louis, Valenciennes, they were all used for housing prisoners of war, those border fortresses. And Britons were treated on a par with their French counterparts in this country.
Were any of the prisoners given the opportunity to enlist in the Royal Navy?
Yes, a lot of the, certainly in the 1790s, after Camperdown, some of the Dutch prisoners enlisted in the Royal Navy. You find a lot of the Danes enlist as well. So you find Danes enlisting in the Royal Navy and the merchant service too. So some of them did. The Navy was always after sort of men to man its ships, you know, so they lost a lot of men due to disease and injury on board vessels. So they had to make up those numbers somehow. So they were very keen on using the sort of man power that was available in the prison ships. They were allowed to recruit, well, all these forces were allowed to recruit Germans. Germans and Dutch were the preferred ones, and Danes as well, but not Frenchmen nor Italians of dubious character, as the regulations put it.
Was the death rate on the hulks greater or less than the death rates in the land prisons?
Well, I mentioned that on the hulks at Chatham, 1,300 odd prisoners died there. At Norman Cross, for example, over the course of its history, 1,770 prisoners died there. It depended on what diseases were prevalent, what took hold there. The sort of higher number at Norman Cross is due to an enteric fever outbreak in 1800, which was due to sort of sewage contaminating the water supply. Interestingly, on board the prison ships, when you look at the actual causes of death, you don't get many dysentery cases. And I would assume that's because the sewage can be disposed of very easily over the side. It won't contaminate your water supply, but you do get a lot more respiratory infections and serious outbreaks of typhus. So the death rate during this period overall was about 8.5% of the prisoner population died on board the prison ships. Conversely, how many had their health seriously affected by it and sort of went home and died because of whatever disease, consumption, for example, they contracted on board, but then they might have contracted that anyway in civilian life. So were the hulks worst in terms of sort of health? It depended very much on what sort of health issue was arising. Bear in mind, however, that prisoners were coming into the system with pre-existing health conditions. And also, an interesting little point I didn't mention, that if a prisoner could convince a surgeon on board the prison ship that his health was being seriously affected by his confinement on board the ship, that surgeon will get that prisoner transferred to a land depot, where it might be a little bit more healthy. But prisoners died in fair numbers in all the prison depots.
Was drinking water provided as well as small beer?
Yes, they had these sort of barrels of water brought on board as well. So yes, they had drinking water, they had small beer, they had their ration of 2 pints per day, but each ship had a canteen where one of the perks of being a clerk or a turnkey on board one of these prison ships or in the land depot was selling small beer to the prisoners so they can make a little supplement to their income by doing so. So there was a canteen where prisoners could buy extra small beer if they so wished, but water was supplied as well.
The Chatham prison ship depot, do we know where the prisoners of war were buried? And are they to be disinterred and examined?
Right, yeah, the story of the Chatham prisoners who were buried in Gillingham Creek. In the 1860s, the dockyard was being expanded onto part of that burial ground. So a lot of the prisoners' bodies were exhumed and put onto St. Mary's Island, which about 30 odd years ago was being developed into a marina there. Now, during the course of some of the bodies were put onto St. Mary's Island, some other bodies were discovered in the early part of the 20th century and put in a burial ground just behind St. George's Centre in the dockyard. And the memorial that was on St. Mary's Island was moved from that burial ground to the one at St. George's, but the burials at St. Mary's Island was left there. So you've got all these corpses going all around, all these bodies going all around the area. And there's probably still a few left in Gillingham Creek. So some ended up on St. Mary's Island, some ended up behind St. George's Centre. 30 years ago, the area of St. Mary's Island was being redeveloped. So the bodies there were exhumed and put alongside the bodies under the memorial, which was originally on St. Mary's Island, but is now behind St. George's Centre. And so all the bodies that are known are there. But I do think looking at the numbers on the death certificates, there are a few still left in Gillingham Creek, which have yet to be exhumed. But most of them are buried in Chatham now.
Paul, I'm going to stop there. Absolutely brilliant. Always fascinating to listen to you. Absolutely great. And as Howard just said, yeah, thank you very much for a superb talk.
Okay, you're welcome.
Nicely summed up. One parish notice, which is that next week Andrew Field will be here, well, not in my house, I hope, but he'll be here talking about the Imperial Guard at Waterloo, which promises to be very interesting. Thank you again, Paul.
Okay.
I'll say good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everyone.